On the Company Emissions Data page on the Career Fair Sustainability Initiative website, we have collected emissions data and financial data on many of the companies at the Fall Career Fair. This allows students to compare the carbon emissions and carbon intensity of the different companies they are looking to potentially work for. We hope that this will empower students to bring sustainability into their considerations about jobs, not only now, but into the future. We created 3 interactive graphs using data on how much carbon a company emits and how much they spend on their operating costs. We chose these 2 metrics as a standardized method for students to compare across a vast variety of companies. But it's important to recognize that this data is a small part of what sustainability might mean for a company. We are not looking at the context of what this data might mean, what programs or goals that the company has in place to be more sustainable, but we wanted to provide specific data that the students can use as a jumping off point in their discussions about sustainability. Sustainability is a concept that is very difficult to quantify or grade a company on. So we wanted to provide students clear, raw data that could help them gain a little insight into the companies that they are looking at and provide them a foundation for them to ask more questions and to dive deeper. Not all companies are included in our analysis, and this is because not all companies have their emissions data and financial data to be public. And to view the list of companies that are registered for the career fair but excluded from our data set, you can click here. Before showing the graphs, it's important to recognize a couple of terms that we use. So the first is carbon emissions, which is the yearly carbon emissions a company directly produces. And then our other term is carbon intensity, which is the carbon emissions divided by the operating costs of the specific company. And we provide carbon intensity data to help students compare small companies to larger companies more fairly. And lastly, clustering is how we group the company's data that we collected to allow students to best understand the difference in how much different companies emitted. And if you'd like to learn more about how we conducted this analysis, you can click on the methodology page on our website. Our first interactive figure shows company carbon emissions data normalized by operating costs from 2011 to 2020. This figure is useful for students to look at the carbon intensity of the companies and see if the companies are exhibiting trends in that emissions intensity. Are they increasing, decreasing, or staying the same? On the right, you can see this bar showing all the companies included in the data. And if we want to look at more specifics, we can unclick all, and then we can click the specific companies that we want to look at and compare. So for example, perhaps I want to compare AT&T to another company such as Facebook. And then I'm also looking at perhaps Microsoft. So as you can see, each time you click one of the companies, data pops up on the figure. And then you can look at the specific values, look at the different companies, and compare them to each other. So in this example, we can see how AT&T does have the higher carbon intensity compared to Microsoft and Facebook, but over time it has had a pretty significant and steady downward trend. Microsoft, on the other hand, though it had lower carbon intensity, it has been showing since 2015 a pretty steady increase in its carbon intensity. Unlike Facebook, which for the data that we have has been showing a steady and significant decrease over time. Now, after comparing these 3 companies to each other, perhaps we want to look at even more. And we can easily add other companies to the figure, such as perhaps we want to also look at Shell, and we want to also look at Exxon. And as you can see, these two companies, Shell and Exxon, have significantly higher carbon intensity than the three that we were looking at before. And as we added them to graph, it increased the y-axis so we could include all their data. This significant difference in carbon intensity is likely because Exxon and Shell are in a much more carbon intensive industry than the companies such as Facebook and AT&T. So when looking at this data, it's important that we bring in the context of what industry the company is, what work they're doing, and what that might mean for how much carbon they emit. This graph is great for looking at trends over time. Perhaps you might want to look at specific companies and how much are they actually emitting into the atmosphere. And this graph is not normalized by operating costs. So this is all about the specific carbon emissions of the companies. And as you can see, you can not only filter by company, but also by industry. And these sidebars work in much the same way as the one before. You can unclick all and then add the specific ones that you want to look at, such as perhaps energy and education. And this adds the companies that are included in our analysis that are in that specific industry. And then you can look at how they compare across industries, across to each other. And by going over the circle, you can look at the specific amount of carbon emissions that that company is producing. And this data point is an average of carbon emissions between 2016 and 2020, so over the past 4 years. And while you can filter by industry, if you want to look at specific companies, you can do the same thing we did before, unclick all, and then click the specific companies you want to look at. So perhaps you want to look at Apple compared to Boeing, compared to Amazon. And every time you add a company, it adds on to the figure. And then you can compare them to each other. And you can also look at how much is the average carbon emissions of that company from 2016 to 2020. And then you can look at the other company and see how much is it differing. And our last interactive graph is very similar to that one, but it is normalized by operating costs. So we're looking at the average carbon emissions between 2016 to 2020, normalized by the operating costs. So we're looking at carbon intensity. And this allows us to compare smaller companies to larger companies more fairly. And when looking at the previous graph, we can see maybe a company may be emitting more, but the data looks different when we factor in how much are they spending on operating costs. And this one is also controlled by this bar on the side. And we can add them all in and look at how they might differ between the two. Because these three graphs are interactive, there are a lot of different ways that you can explore the data, compare companies, and conduct your own analyses. Again, it's important to recognize that this data is one small part of what it might mean to be sustainable. But we hope that this data and these visualizations can help you incorporate sustainability into your decision-making process, and that it serves as a foundation for further exploration into the companies that you are looking into.